Sarah stood in front of the mirror, her heart pounding with excitement. She was a vision in white, her wedding dress cascading around her like a cloud. Her long dark hair was pinned up elegantly, and her eyes sparkled with joy. Today was the day she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. The day she would marry the love of her life, Michael. But as she stared at her reflection, her phone buzzed on the dresser. She smiled, thinking it was a sweet message from Michael, something about how excited he was to see her walk down the aisle. But when she picked up the phone and saw his name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. Something felt wrong. She answered the call with a trembling hand. "Michael," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sarah." Michael's voice was barely a whisper, full of hesitation. I can't do this." Her heart sank. "What do you mean?" "The wedding is in an hour. Everyone is waiting." "I know, but I can't marry you, Sarah," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm not coming." The world around Sarah seemed to spin. She clutched the phone tightly, her knuckles turning white. "Michael, what are you talking about? Why would you say that?" "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his words heavy with guilt. "My boss, Mrs. Hamilton, she has feelings for me. She told me last night. She offered me a lot of money if I marry her instead." Sarah felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. Mrs. Hamilton was the owner of the company where Michael worked, a powerful woman known for getting what she wanted. But this was beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. "You're choosing money over me?" Sarah's voice was filled with disbelief and hurt. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," Michael admitted, his voice filled with shame. "She threatened to ruin me if I didn't agree. I'm sorry." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she fought to keep her voice steady. "Michael, you're really going to do this? Leave me standing at the altar?" There was a long pause. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I can't go against her. I just can't." The call ended, and Sarah was left standing in her wedding dress, her future crumbling around her. She couldn't think straight. What would she tell the guests? Her parents? Her mind raced, searching for a solution. And then, out of nowhere, a desperate idea flashed through her mind. She grabbed her phone and dialed another number. It rang twice before it was answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was familiar, comforting in its own way. "David, it's Sarah," she said, her voice shaking. "I need your help." David was Michael's younger brother, a carefree spirit who spent most of his time gaming and hanging out with friends. He wasn't the responsible type, but he and Sarah had always shared a close bond. She could confide in him when she couldn't talk to anyone else. "Sarah?" "What's wrong?" David asked, concern evident in his voice. "Michael." "He's not coming," Sarah blurted out. "He's marrying his boss. She offered him money and he's choosing her over me." David was silent for a moment, processing what she had just said. "What? That's insane. What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice breaking. "I can't tell my parents. It would kill them. Everyone is here, waiting for a wedding. I can't face them alone." "Sarah," David started, but she cut him off. "David, I know this is crazy, but I need you to marry me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When David finally spoke, his voice was filled with shock and uncertainty. "You want me to marry you? But I'm not Michael. I'm not ready for something like this." "I know," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "But I can't do this alone. Please, David, I need you. Just pretend for today. We can figure everything out later." David was quiet again, and Sarah could hear his breathing steady and deep. She could picture him running his hand through his messy hair, trying to make sense of it all. "Okay," David finally said, his voice firm. "I'll do it. For you." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "Thank you, David. I don't know how to repay you." "We'll get through this together," he assured her. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Sarah hung up the phone and stared at herself in the mirror again. Her eyes were red from crying, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. There was no time for tears now. She had to be strong, for herself, for David, and for the family and friends waiting downstairs. 15 minutes later, David arrived looking uncharacteristically nervous in a hastily borrowed suit. His hair was still a bit messy and there was a hint of panic in his eyes, but when he saw Sarah, he managed a small, reassuring smile. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his arm. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, taking his arm. Together they walked down the stairs toward the gathered guests who had no idea of the turmoil that had just unfolded. The ceremony was a blur. Sarah and David exchanged vows, their voices steady despite the chaos in their hearts. They smiled for the cameras, kissed when they were told to, and tried to keep up the charade. But beneath the surface, they both knew the truth. This was no fairy tale wedding. It was a desperate act to save face, to protect their families from heartbreak. After the ceremony, as they sat together at the reception, David leaned in close to Sarah. "So, what do we do now?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know. We'll take it one day at a time, I guess." David nodded, his expression serious. "We'll figure it out. Together." The days after the wedding were a whirlwind. Sarah and David found themselves thrown into a world they were not prepared for. Marriage. They moved into a small apartment, away from the prying eyes of their families. It was awkward at first, living together as husband and wife when they had always been just friends. But they tried to make the best of it. David, who had spent most of his time gaming and hanging out with friends, suddenly found himself facing the responsibilities of a husband. He had to get a job, something stable, to support their new life. It wasn't easy for him, but he pushed himself, determined to make it work. Sarah, on the other hand, was trying to come to terms with the fact that the man she had loved was gone. She threw herself into her work, trying to keep her mind off the betrayal and the pain that still lingered. But every time she looked at David, she was reminded of what had happened and the sacrifices they were both making. Despite the challenges, they started to build a life together. They cooked meals, argued over small things like who would do the dishes, and slowly began to understand each other in ways they never had before. It wasn't the passionate love story Sarah had dreamed of, but it was something real, something that grew stronger with each passing day. But their new life wasn't without its difficulties. The first major challenge came when Michael, the man who had left Sarah at the altar, suddenly reappeared. He showed up at their apartment one evening looking disheveled and desperate. "Sarah, I made a mistake," Michael said, his voice shaking as he stood at the door. "I shouldn't have left you. Mrs. Hamilton." It was all a lie. She didn't love me. She just wanted to control me, and now she's ruined everything. Sarah felt a rush of emotions, anger, hurt, and a strange sense of relief. "What do you want, Michael?" "I want to make things right," he said, his eyes pleading. "I want you back." Before Sarah could respond, David stepped forward. "She's not yours to take back," he said firmly, his voice filled with a protective anger that surprised even him. "You made your choice, Michael. Now you have to live with it." Michael looked at David, then back at Sarah, realizing for the first time what he had truly lost. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy, but she knew it was too late. "I'm sorry too, Michael. But you can't just come back and expect everything to be the same. I've moved on." Michael nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah and David standing together in the doorway. "Are you okay?" David asked, his voice soft. Sarah nodded, wiping away a tear. "Yeah, I think I am." As time passed, Sarah and David grew closer, their bond deepening with every challenge they faced. They learned to support each other, to lean on one another in times of need. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, of uncertainty about what the future would hold. But they faced those moments together, hand in hand. Their biggest test came a year into their marriage when Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news was both thrilling and terrifying. They were still figuring out how to be a couple, how to be a team, and now they were going to be parents. But instead of panicking, they embraced the challenge. David, who had once been a carefree gamer, stepped up in ways Sarah had never imagined. He found a better job, one that allowed him to support their growing family, and he started taking on more responsibilities at home. Sarah, too, found herself changing, growing into her role as a wife and soon-to-be mother. As they prepared for the arrival of their baby, they reflected on how far they had come. What had started as a desperate act to save face had turned into something real, something strong and unbreakable. They had built a life together, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. On the day their baby was born, David held Sarah's hand and looked into her eyes. "I never thought we'd end up here," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Neither did I," Sarah replied, tears of joy streaming down her face. "But I'm so glad we did." As they welcomed their child into the world, Sarah realized that their story was far from the fairy tale she had once imagined. It was something better, real, messy, full of unexpected twists and turns. And in the end, that made it all the more beautiful. They had faced the world together and they had won.